that's everywhere. It's ubiquitous, right? So climate change is acting on wetlands across Montana, in national parks, outside of national parks. And I would argue that we need to pay closer attention to climate change in wetlands. Wetlands are particularly vulnerable to climate change. They're our shallowest wetland habitats. And also they interact with all those things Steve just described and that others have talked about. So I would just ask after this talk that when you're thinking about your project plans in the future, when you're thinking about your monitoring plans, that they're all climate informed. And the Park Service has sort of embraced this. We're using something called climate smart conservation. And so you can ask yourself, when you have project goals in the future, are these climate smart goals? Or when you're considering a response variable for monitoring, is this a climate smart response variable? So as I go through my presentation, I'm going to talk a lot about climate change in wetlands. But my goal is to convince you that this should transform how we think about the work that we do as wetland professionals. I also want to acknowledge David Thoma here. He's my co-author. David is a climate scientist in our group, and really he's done a lot of the hard work to provide me tools to look at the data. So I'm going to just start with some slides that we're all familiar with. This is global temperatures from 1880 to 2018. The baseline here for this anomaly here is 1950 to 1980. But we can see from 1980 to present day, temperatures globally are rising. If we look at national park units, and this is from a paper that Bill Monahan and Nick Fisichelli did in 2014, 80% or over 80% of our parks are now in the warmest 95th percentile of their recorded history. So we're talking about places, despite being really protected, they're hotter than they were historically. If we look at just the western U.S., we can see one of the manifestations of climbing temperatures is declining snowpacks. And for a lot of our wetlands, it's melting snow that fills those wetlands each year, so declining snowpacks is troubling. And then as we move, this is Grand Teton National Park, as we move down and narrow our focus to a place, we can see that Moose, Wyoming today, in terms of its average annual temperature, is likely to be a very different place depending on the climate scenario you pick. But Moose, Wyoming in 2100 might look a lot more like Rollins or Cheyenne. And so when we think about wetland resources at Grand Teton National Park, we can look to places that are warmer and drier to get an understanding or to provide some anticipation of what the future might look like. Or if you're in Yellowstone National Park and that idea is hard to comprehend, we can consider our future relative to some historic benchmark. Like, what were deficit conditions in 1988 that produced the largest fires in Yellowstone history, and will our future be closer to conditions that we all worried about in 1988? We also have a lot of modeling tools at our disposal, and so we can look at present-day snowpacks and see what those look like mid-century for the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, including Yellowstone and Grand Teton National Park, and by the end of the century. And we can see that there's less snow on the landscape. This is April 1 squeeze. There's less snow on the landscape and less runoff to fill wetlands. So in Yellowstone National Park, I'm going to talk a little bit about the northern range here, but there's already very clear evidence that wetlands are smaller and shallower than they were historically. And one of the best examples we see here are these lichen trim lines. So these are proxies for historic high water. Lichens don't grow underwater. So when we see these high water marks that are now a meter or so above current high water level, we know that sometime in the last century, waters were much higher than they were today. In other places, it's even oh, sorry. And there's a number of papers now in Yellowstone that sort of document these changes, and so I can point you to those. But there's evidence all over the northern range, and so here you've got some rhyolitic rocks above Floating Island Lake, and you can see that high water levels were historically 2 meters higher than they are today. There's also some historic photographs, so we can look at, if right outside Tower Junction, if we look at Rainy Lake circa 1890, and we look at 1980, maximum water levels or high water levels in Rainy Lake were similar. If we look at what Rainy Lake, a place that has historically had a strong population of tiger salamanders, if we look at that in 2003, Rainy Lake is just a fraction of its historic size. 2008, several years into a multi-year drought, you can see just a puddle here in Rainy Lake. And then 2 years ago, we had pretty high water levels in Yellowstone. And we see that Rainy Lake did respond to higher water levels. Is there other evidence that suggests that at least the northern range of Yellowstone is drying? Yeah, we see in the Lamar River, if we look at 7-day minimum low flows, we can see that regardless of the percentile that you're looking at, low flows in the Lamar are declining, which probably means regional groundwater is dropping a little bit. And you know what's driving all this? This is just a normalized drought index, and this summary is from Mammoth, so the headquarters in Yellowstone National Park. And you can certainly see that the last 30 years have been drier than they were historically. So what I want to share with you today is just some stories from Yellowstone and Grand Teton National Park. This actually comes from our long-term wetland and amphibian monitoring program. Our program was established in 2006, right in the middle of a multi-year drought, unfortunately. But it's based on a stratified random design, which does allow us to make inferences to the park. And we stratified it by these subbasins that are in different colors here. And we did that so we would get some a good distribution, spatial distribution, when we actually implemented the monitoring. And so what I'm going to talk about later and share some stories is how we're beginning to use subbasin level analyses to determine which vulnerables or which wetlands are most vulnerable, or which parts of the park have wetlands that are more vulnerable to climate change. We typically visit these sites once a year. So we get to go to a site somewhere between middle of June and late July. So our responses are sort of binary. Was that wetland wet or was it dry? And we're starting to build off of that data set, but we've learned a lot just from those visits, those one-time visits per year. We're also starting to throw climate data at everything we do. And this is what I mean when I talk about make sure your plans are climate informed. Take advantage of the climate information that is accessible to all of us. So why look at climate change and wetlands, and why do it in a national park? Well, we have obviously fewer disturbances in the national park. And then I would argue places like Yellowstone and Grand Teton are big enough and they're climatologically heterogeneous enough that we can learn information both from among-year comparisons but also within-year comparisons. So here is just evapotranspiration summaries, cumulative growing degree days, precipitation, and runoff summaries for a given year. But you can see each one of these boxes relates to a catchment or a watershed that we visit, and there's quite a bit of variation in all of these climate drivers even within a given year. We've also learned the influence that rivers and large lakes have. So if we've got wetlands that are nearer to permanent water bodies, we're learning that obviously those are less vulnerable to change. So if we just sort of take a big view of our work, what we're learning is that while wetlands are a small percentage of the landscape, 3% of the landscape in Grand Teton and Yellowstone is made up of wetlands, and 40% of those wetlands are shallow. We can see there's a large degree of variation in the number of wetlands that are flooded or dry, just the inverse of that each year. So in a very dry year like 2007, less than 60% of the 330 wetlands that we visit across these parks were flooded, so 40% dry. And then in a really wet year, like 2011, almost all of the wetlands that we visited were flooded. I will point out that nearly all the observations that we make on dry wetlands are shallow wetlands, wetlands that when we show up, their maximum water depths, when flooded, are less than ½ meter. We can also, again, 2007 was a dry year, 2011 a wet year. We can take sort of a landscape level look at this. Here's NDVI summaries of these two places from these 2 years from July. And you can see, even in a wet year, there are some places in Yellowstone that are still dry. So that 4% of the wetlands, the 12 wetlands that were dry that year, they show up in these red areas of the park. So even in an overwhelmingly wet year, there's a lot of variation within space. In a dry year, we can see almost everything in Yellowstone is pretty dry that year, relative to the 20 to 2018 average. If we look at an individual wetland, so this is on Blacktail Plateau in Yellowstone's northern range, and we can see that this wetland toggles between wet and dry depending on the year. If we look at climate data for this particular wetland, and we come up with runoff estimates, we can see 0 here in orange is our long-term average. So this is based on climate data from 1980 to present. This is our average runoff, annual runoff for this site. On years when we have deviations that are positive, they're greater than the long-term average, we have a flooded wetland. When we have deviations that are below the long-term average in runoff, we have dry wetlands. But the deviations are pretty small here, so 50 millimeters. Keep that number in mind as we move through this. But we're able to essentially describe the sensitivity of an individual wetland from our annual monitoring data. Here's another wetland. This is a wetland down in the southwest corner of the park in Beckler, for folks that are familiar with it. And again, this wetland toggles between wet and dry. Beckler is a pretty wet area. And what's interesting is our threshold here is not at 0. This one has some buffering from surrounding river systems. So in fact, the deviation from the long-term runoff value needs to be greater than 100 millimeters to create a dry wetland down in Beckler. But wetlands still dry down in Beckler. So I just showed some examples of individual wetland dynamics and some park-wide summaries, some regional summaries, and now I just want to summarize or share with you a little paper we just published that talks about sub-basin level summaries. So again, the different colors here represent different sub-basins. This is the Madison, Gallatin, Upper Yellowstone, Northern Range, Snake Henry's, and the Grand Teton subbasin. So what we did here is we varied runoff from 525 millimeters down to 225 millimeters for all of the subbasins, and then we looked at the probability of drying as runoff levels declined. And what we found is that 3 subbasins showed way greater sensitivity, much greater sensitivity to changes in runoff than the northern range, a place that we often talk about. And in fact, the odds of wetland and drying in the Snake Henry subbasin were 50 times that of the northern range. So what does that look like when we plot the data? If we plot the data, we've got runoff here along the x-axis, and we've got the probability of drying on the y. So as runoff declines, we see an increasing probability of drying. And in the Snake Henry subbasin that contains wetlands in Beckler Meadow, we can see as runoff declines, we can actually reach a place where 100% of the wetlands are likely to dry. Why do we care about that? That's an important part of the park for chorus frogs, spotted frogs, and terrestrial garter snakes. And then this is some stuff we're doing right now. I've been working with a colleague, Megan Halabitsky, for a few years now, and she's using remote sensing tools to characterize within year and among year variation in wetland hydrographs. And so I'm just presenting today a case study of 2 sites in Yellowstone's northern range. They literally are separated by about 5 kilometers, But this is an important story because it shows that individual wetlands have different sensitivities to climate change. Both of these are big wetlands. So one is on Crystal Bench, and the other is in Little America, and it's actually called Trumpeter Lake. But what I'm showing here on this graph, and it's a messy graph, the blue here is runoff summaries by year from 1985 to current. The red line shows changes in wetland area of Trumpeter Lake. It's this one here, and it actually used to have trumpeter swans on it. And the other one is on Crystal Bench. So this wetland here, and here's the variations in wetland area there. Obviously, they're both responding to annual runoff, but one of them bounced around long enough at this level and then reached some threshold during the early 2000s drought, dropped down. It had a new wetland area, sort of maximum wetland area, and is not returned to that original size. So if we look at that, here's Crystal Bench. What I'm showing is annual runoff in the histogram through time, and then the June, July, and August wetland area estimates from Landsat imagery. And so what you can see here in red is the wetland area estimates. It goes down during this 2 years of low runoff, comes back up. But then during the multi-year drought of the early 2000s, it drops and has a wetland area now that is much smaller than it was pre-drought, and it hasn't climbed out of that. So this information is actually really cool. It allows us to look at how wetland hydrographs change through time, and it's being done with Landsat. Another one, Trumpeter Lake, again, it bounced around through time as changes in runoff occurred through this time series. But in the drought between 2000 and 2007, or 1990 and 2007, you can see that Trumpeter Lake almost went to zero. It was almost gone. It almost became dry land. It has recovered out of that during some of the the big runoff years of 2008, 2011, 2014. But we can see if a future in Yellowstone is drier with less runoff, we're likely to lose places like Trumpeter Lake, or at least in drier years, a place that historically supported trumpeter swan breeding. So these are future projections in runoff for the upper Yellowstone subbasin, and this is in inches here, but 2 inches is about 50 millimeters, 4 inches is 100 millimeters. So depending on which climate scenario, climate future you're looking at, runoff in the upper Yellowstone subbasin is projected to be 50 to 100 millimeters lower than it is today. In places like Trumpeter Lake, that in low years goes dry or near dry, these are years with 75 millimeters of runoff. So places like Trumpeter Lake are likely to disappear on the landscape in dry years. Remember Blacktail Plateau. Here's a site that when you had any deviation from the long-term average runoff, it went dry. It's likely to go dry. And then we can look at these different subbasin summaries. Remember, I broke Yellowstone and Grand Teton up into 6 different subbasins. We can apply this information to the sensitivities of each of the wetlands in each of these subbasins. So what do we know? We know wetland drying is widespread in national parks and outside national parks. We know that annual drying is associated with runoff, at least in Yellowstone and Grand Teton. Sensitivity of wetland drying varies by wetland and subbasin. We also are using remote sensing technologies, and we believe those are going to provide added clarity on wetland dynamics. But what we're bracing for in places like Yellowstone and Grand Teton is a future with fewer wetlands, and a future with shallower wetlands, a future with wetlands with shorter hydrographs. But the cool thing about the work that we're doing, mainly through the support and collaboration with our colleagues, is we can now provide vulnerability assessments at the wetland level, if necessary, to the managers of the parks. That's all I have. Yep.
I just had a question. It looks as though you're mainly looking at ephemeral wetlands here, right? So there's some subsurface ground, they may be somewhat groundwater, but there's small basins that they drain, right? Because I think I've been to almost all of those. The one was by Buffalo Point. the one that you had, I've seen it dry. I guess what I'm saying is I think I've seen it in the summer. So they don't have a lot of vegetation, maybe some bulrushes, just little bits of things. Are you going to eventually look at some of the like more groundwater dependent ecosystems too, or are these kind of the canaries in the coal mine for you guys initially?
Our sample frame was set up to look at habitats that supported amphibian breeding.
Oh, okay.
So these are, these aren't all small wetlands. Some of these are, a few hectares in size. But you're right. I mean, there's unmodeled influences, both with large permanent surface water units like the Snake River or Yellowstone Lake nearby, that provide some sort of groundwater contribution to these wetlands. But what we're seeing is, without looking at whether something's got a groundwater nexus or it's supported by surface water, 40% of the wetlands we visit across the landscape. These are all NWI wetlands. They're dry in dry years. So yeah, we could begin to sort of parse that and say groundwater wetlands or wetlands that are nearby a large water body are less vulnerable to changes in runoff or temperature. But when we just sort of step back from that and say, let's look at all of the wetlands that we visit, 40% are dry in a dry year. And yeah, these are, admittedly, these are shallow wetland systems. They're important for amphibian breeding. They're probably important for all kinds of wetland-dependent species. But to me, what this has allowed us to do is say there's a real climate signal.
Yeah, and I didn't want to diminish that either.
Yeah.
And I was going to ask about if you've looked at landscape connectivity and also in the context of life history strategy and lifespan of these species. So, distance, they could switch. Many of these species are capable of switching the wetlands they breed in.
Yeah. We've done some nearest neighbor work. I think the original analysis that was published for specifically looking at the amphibian side of this work, nearest neighbors were important. What's really interesting in a paper we just got out is that at least with spotted frogs, they tend to breed in the same places year after year after year. So we're not really seeing a lot of switching. But the interesting side note of that, not surprising but interesting, is these are deeper wetlands. Chorus frogs, on the other hand, do use these ephemeral wetland systems. So in a wet year, they may breed there. In a dry year, obviously there's no chorus frog breeding, but then they'll recolonize a previously dry wetland. But spotted frogs and tiger salamanders don't seem to be doing that. So they really, at least here and in the sites that we're visiting, they appear to be using the same sites. Now, it doesn't mean they don't move to, after breeding, they don't move to other wetland sites, but they tend to be breeding in the same sites that they have since 2006.
Are there different parts of the park that the connectivity is much more impacted?
Yeah, so I think in the northern range, connectivity changes greatly, whether it's a wet year or dry year. Some of these higher elevation subbasins, we can do the projections on them. Runoff levels are still going to be pretty high because there's still going to be a decent snowpack in 2100. It's going to be different than today's snowpack. But yeah, the sort of wetter parts of the parks where there's higher connectivity, we know that amphibians will have choices. It was really surprising to us to see how Beckler dries out in a dry year, because that's one of those places when you go in there and you're frogging in a wet year, there is water everywhere, but it dries out quickly. And it's lower elevation, and I think that's something to keep in mind too as we move outside the park boundaries when we're talking about lower elevation sites that have wetlands. Those are particularly sensitive because temperatures are climbing faster.
So I have a question, Andy, in terms of measuring the impact of management actions. When you have all this background stuff going on from year to year, the variability in wetland surface, how does somebody design a monitoring strategy that accommodates that in addition to the changes that have resulted from management?
Yeah, and I don't have the answer. I bet everybody in this room is smarter than I am. What I can say in Yellowstone is difficult because in wet years, how do you define a site? An amphibian breeding site? Because in some, as Bryce was saying, in some of these years, these sites are connected by surface waters. It's not a groundwater nexus. This is a surface water nexus. So it's difficult. But I think we need to keep in mind that we have to plan as much as we can to capture, this sort of important climate covariate, this important climate signal. And yeah, we're going to have wet years, but we're also going to have particularly dry years. And our monitoring strategies need to be robust enough that we can sort of monitor across the sort of that type of variation. What we also know, in addition to it being a drier future, it's going to be a more variable future, right? So we're going to see way greater extremes. And this kind of quantile regression has been really fun to look at that. Quantile regression lets you parse out the upper 25th percentile of your measurements and the lower 75th and see if the beta, the regression, the slopes are different. In many cases, they are. The lower or the drier conditions are getting drier and the wetter conditions are getting wetter. So we do need to have monitoring plans and designs that are sufficiently robust that we can capture variation across wet and dry conditions. Yep.
Are many or any of these wetlands beaver influenced and seeing any difference in those?
Yeah, some of them. Unfortunately, not as many as we'd like. Beavers are moving into Yellowstone, and they're kind of coming in from the forest from the north. Certainly, when beavers come in, that changes the hydrology altogether, right? And those tend to be more stable wetland systems. That's also important outside of hydrology. Those also tend to be hotspots for amphibians. So when we have beavers move in, a couple years later, amphibians move in and use those sites. So beavers are really important, both in terms of changing the hydrology and providing some buffering to the climate signal. They also are really important in terms of increasing biological diversity. At least, again, in the wetland sites that we visit. Yep. Go ahead, Rich.
Can you go back to your slide on where you had the photographs and particular photographic series?
Way back there, Larry. These.
Yeah. So,
oh, so this is not a hydrograph. So this is, I should have done a better job of describing. This is the annual runoff. This is the deviation from long-term annual runoff each year. So in 2006, the runoff, and I don't have 2006 shown, but in 2007, the runoff was about 100 millimeters below the long-term average, and we had a dry wetland. 2008, it was 10 or 15 millimeters above the long-term average, and we had a wet wetland. And so all I was trying to do with this is show that for an individual wetland, we can sort of characterize its sensitivity to variations in runoff.
Sure. So what I was picking up on was 2011 was a wet year.
Yeah.
And you showed the ponds being fairly full.
Uh-huh.
And then 2017 is showing to even be a wetter year, but it's much smaller.
Yeah, and that's preceded by a couple of really dry years.
So you think that that's
Yeah, what's happening with runoff, and this is important in terms of understanding our future, what's happening with runoff is we're beginning to generate runoff in the fall. So if our soils are wet and full in the fall, when we accumulate snow and that snow starts to melt, it doesn't take much melting to fully saturate those soils and let them run off. But if our previous fall was really dry, then we're starting with a lower cup. Our cup is really empty. And so the snow melt is going to happen. We first have to saturate the soils to 100%, and then above that we'll generate runoff.